Please join me in giving Robert Litan a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of the book. I'm going to give you an advance warning here. This is not going to be a political talk, okay? This is going to be about what economists do, and it's largely aimed at people in business. And obviously, I'm assuming that that will strike a chord with you, because during the course of my career, it's been my experience that many business people doubt the value of economists. Their first instinct is, well, economists have never met a payroll, what the hell do they know? I want to try to prove them wrong, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. There's a second reason I wrote the book. It's embarrassing when you're kids. This happened to me when probably my kids were 10, 12 or whatever. When they ask you, Daddy, what do you do? All right, and I'm a lawyer and an economist, and I can explain to them what a lawyer does. But try explaining to a 10 or 12-year-old what an economist does. All right, it didn't quite work well. I didn't have a Cliff Notes answer, and that's because, well, now by the way, I should tell you the end of the story. My daughter took economics in college, and now she's getting her PhD in a scientific subject, and my son is an internet entrepreneur, and they know economics, but it took them a long time to figure it out. But if I were to ask you, and ask probably any random audience what an economist does, I won't embarrass you by asking you for the answer, but the answer that I predict you will give me is that you think economists have been created to predict the course of the economy. All right, what we call macroeconomics, for those of you who took Economics 101. In other words, predict GDP, inflation, unemployment, and so forth. And that is certainly the popular perception. And so when we had the financial crisis that is represented by all those companies that went down the tubes, you recognize all these pictures from the financial crisis. I'm showing them for a reason. The reason is that during the financial crisis, or before it, a lot of economists got blamed for the crisis because we didn't fix it, or we didn't predict it. So for example, Alan Greenspan, almost up until the end, was saying the economy's doing fine. Ben Bernanke said the same thing, economy's doing fine. Now it's a separate subject about what Ben did after the economy went south. In my personal opinion, and this may or may not qualify as a political statement, I actually think Ben Bernanke helped save the US economy and the global economy from a recession. But he didn't forecast what was going to happen. And so the public perception is that we screwed up. What good are we? And that's the second reason I wrote the book, because the reality is that is not what 98% of economists do. We don't predict the future. What we do is we try to understand the behavior of individual markets, whether it's real estate or construction or the steel industry, auto industry. We try to understand consumer behavior. We try to understand market structure and so forth, things that have nothing to do with the macroeconomy. And the really interesting thing is, and what this book is full of, is examples that I'm going to give you a Cliff Notes version of how economists have come up with ideas, either directly or indirectly, that have made American businesses lots of money. And the title of my book is $1 Trillion, and my claim is that if you add up all the value that economists have contributed, it's well over $1 trillion to the economy. All right, that's in a nutshell. Now, in the course of this, we're going to play a game based on a new technology that I've adopted, and it requires you having cell phones. So the question is, how many of you have cell phones in your pocket? I'm hoping that virtually everybody does, all right? So what I want you to do is, you see that number, we're going to see if this works. I want you to text to that number, okay? And what I want you to do is put in the text, I'm doing it myself because I want to keep track of all of you, all right? You put in the phone number, wait a minute, 8301 830, and then in the body of the text, what we're going to do is, I want you to put, I'm still challenged myself. Okay, in the body of the text, I want you to put, actually, it's hashtag trillion, then I want you to add 1. trillion one, not just trillion. Then put your name, all right, like George Pearson, and then put your email address. Okay? So hashtag trillion one, space, name, spat, and then another space, and then your email address. Okay? Let's all do that. And then I'm going to tell you why I'm asking you to do this. Oh, and then obviously after you finish that, put send. And hopefully you're going to get a message back saying that you've joined the network. Did you get something back, something called conveyor? All right. When you see that, I want you to click that on. See if I can make a click. Yeah, it's working for me. And it's going to come up with 4 questions, and I don't want you to run ahead to the 4 questions. I want you to stop at the first question because we're going to play a game. I'm going to give you questions throughout my presentation, and the winner, the person who gets the most correct answers, this will assign you points for correct answers. The winner is going to get a free book. Okay? All right? And the very first thing that you will probably see there, I hope, you see $1 Trillion Economist Challenge. Do you see that? I hope. Do you see that? $1 Trillion Economist Challenge, and then you can put play and just punch play, and it comes up. And the very first thing that you see after you do that is something called the Julian Simon bet. Are you there? Yeah. Okay, stop. Don't do anything. Okay? Now, I ran this, I did a version of this talk at K-State about 2 weeks ago, and I did it with college students, and I don't expect you, since it's been a long time since you've been in college, to do as well as they did. But because these are techie questions, all right? But I'm going to ask you questions about economists, and maybe some of you are young enough that you'll actually remember this stuff. And so we're about to find out. But don't do anything yet. I'll tell you when. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Hold that thought. So whether you like him or not, John Maynard Keynes, whether you believe in what he wrote about in terms of macroeconomics, this statement that he made is really true. That we're all slaves of some defunct economist. All right, trust me, that's true. All right, and that was another motivation for I wanted to write the book. I wanted to prove to you that that in fact is the case. So as I said, there is this public belief that we're forecasters. I've told you that we're not. And what I'm going to show you is that they've impacted the economy both directly and indirectly. And if we have time, I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas that are on the shelf that have not yet been introduced in the economy, but they will have come from the words and the writings of economists. These are my audiences for writing the book, and here's where we start. So you recognize this picture, all right? Unfortunately, it seems to be like every damn plane that I fly on looks like this, all right? They're all full. Well, those of you in the room who are old enough to remember the 1970s and before, when you showed up and the airplane was full, what happened to you? Answer, you got bumped, all right? Now, there was an economist who saw this. His name was Julian Simon. He was an economist at Maryland. He's no longer alive. But he thought this was ridiculous, that people were getting bumped. The airlines were overbooking. The reason they were overbooking is why? Because statistically, they knew that some people wouldn't show up. So it paid for them to overbook. But when it happened that enough people showed up that the plane was full, they were throwing people off the plane and making people really angry. And Simon said, what would an economist do to solve this problem? Answer, auction off the seats or have a voucher. And so he proposed this to the Civil Aeronautics Commission, which at that time was regulating air, and it wouldn't fly because we had regulation of airline fares. It took one man who was appointed by Jimmy Carter in 1977 to run the Airline Commission. His name was Alfred Kahn. He was the dean of all regulatory economists. And Kahn said, I'll find a loophole in the law to allow this to happen. And so it was both an economist who thought of the idea and an economist who accepted the idea that made possible the whole idea of vouchers for airlines. It's the first example of auctions actually making its way into industry. By the way, Nestor, I'm not counting real estate, all right? All right, real estate was always auction, but nobody ever thought about putting an auction, for airplane seats. I'll get to to this because there are more businesses based on this. All right. So the very first question I now have for you on your phone is the Julian Simon bet. So if you go back to the conveyor, it's got Julian Simon bet, and oops, what I want you to do is just press on it, and there's some questions I hope that you'll see. And there's a question. Once you press the Julian Simon bet, it shows up, and it says the late economist Julian Simon is famous for winning which of the following bets with Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich was a famous biologist at Stanford University. And it's got 4 choices there, all right? Pick one of those choices now. Just read through it. All right, most of you have answered the question, right? All right, most of you got it right. Not most of you, a plurality of you got it right. All right, 38% picked C. All right, that's the right answer. He made a bet with Paul Ehrlich that 5 metals prices would decline by 1990. At that time, the world was worried about running out of resources. And Simon said, this is nuts. Prices are going to decline because technological advance will make things cheaper to find. I mean, we had the same idea with oil earlier and so forth. And Ehrlich said, no, the world's going to basically come to an end. The prices are going to go up forever. Ehrlich lost the bet. Simon won it. Okay? Very famous bet, by the way. If you Google Julian Simon bet, you will find this on Google. All right. So that's my first example. Here's a better example of an auction. This is a Google page. Wait a minute. Where did it go? Here. Now, we're all familiar with this page. The right-hand side over here has got the ads. All right? Now, when Google started out, how do you think they sold those ads? You're not going to believe this. They went door to door, just like any other media company. So, for example, if they figured a search item was going to show up for dishwashers or TVs or whatever, they went to TV companies or to appliance companies, and they had to go item by item or to their ad agencies. Now, you can quickly realize that as Google exploded in terms of the number of searches, this became totally impractical. And the founders of Google realized this at the beginning. So the president at the time, Eric Schmidt, asked 2 young engineers of the company back in 2004, how do we solve this problem? There's got to be a better way to sell ads on Google. So the 2 engineers were not economists. One was a biologist and another one was another kind of scientist. He was a software engineer. And they said, well, the obvious thing to do is we need to auction off in real time the sites, but we have to figure out a way to auction these things off. Now, the problem with doing an auction in real time on the internet is that if you use what's called a first price auction, which is namely the guy who bids the highest price, the auction would go on forever. It wouldn't stop because someone would always be there to trump it. So the 2 engineers, as a matter of engineering technique, said, we will award the winner who bids the second highest price plus 1 penny. And that stopped the auction. All right? That was an engineering thing. Well, these engineers, they told Eric Schmidt this. And Schmidt said, that makes no sense. I'm giving away the auction. I'm giving away the winner to the second highest price. This is ludicrous. I'm leaving money on the table. So by accident, this is all a true story, it's in the book, he runs in a cocktail party into a man named Hal Barron. Actually, this is the guy. Hal Barron was then dean of the Information Sciences School at Berkeley, and he asked, and by the way, Hal was an expert in auctions. So he said, Hal, does this make any sense? And Hal, after some thinking, basically said, it makes perfect sense. Because there's another man, this guy, William Dickory, who proved mathematically that the second price auction was generally superior to a first price auction. Now, how can that be? As a matter of economics, not engineering. And the answer is, you're probably familiar with something called the winner's curse. It's a person who goes to the auction, they win, and they get caught up in the frenzy, and then they win, and then it's like the guy who catches the dog, that catches the truck, and they say, oh my God, I just overpaid. It's called the winner's curse. You have this winner's regret that you actually won. Well, the way to avoid the winner's curse is to give the auction make the winner the second highest bidder, so that person will never walk away feeling like they got screwed. And knowing into the auction that you are not going to be screwed and walk away feeling that you're going to feel bad, in fact, will make you bid more. And that's what Dickory proved. And Dickory won a Nobel Prize for that. Final story about William Dickory. Dickory was awarded the Nobel Prize when he was 83 years old. He died 3 years later, so he never collected the prize. He's the only person ever to have been awarded a Nobel Prize who actually never received it. It's a tragic story. Next game, next question. So if we go to the thing here on the cell phone, oh yeah, you have to go back and then go down to William Dickory. You go down to Dickory. If you see Dickory, and you go back to that, and we're going to see the questions for Dickory. And it says, the late William Dickory, I may actually have it here. Here are the questions. He was also famous for one of these other things, A, B, C, or D. See, I'll give you a little time, and you tell me what Dickory was famous for. We have a very smart audience. Overwhelmingly, you picked B. Dickory was famous for congestion pricing. I want to talk about that later because it's very relevant to infrastructure as we talk about this as we go on. Okay, we'll continue. Hal Barron, meanwhile, after telling Eric Schmidt that the second price auction was a good idea, that made Google's auction business. In other words, all those ads that you see on Google, they're done by second price auctions. You know how much money Google collects for those auctions a year? $50 billion a year. And it was all because the idea was validated by an economist. If Eric Schmidt hadn't run into Hal Barron, Google as a company probably today would not be the company that it is, which is a huge damn company, all right? Now, Hal then left Berkeley, and he's now Google's chief economist. And so he has done a bunch of other things. I don't have time to go through all these, but he has an army of people that work for him, and they've done a lot of very innovative things at Google because of an economics contribution. Here's a third guy. Anybody know who he is? Just any guesses? Did anybody recognize him? All right. Before I give you his name, anybody recognize this guy? Okay, so this is Captain Kirk. All right. Now, Captain Kirk is associated with what company? Priceline. So the guy that I showed you before was the founder of Priceline, Jay Walker. And just coincidentally, that patent properties company that John talked about that now I'm chief economist of, that was founded by Jay Walker. So Jay and I are now good friends. And we met through the book, by the way. This is a small story. But Jay Walker invented Priceline, all right? Now, he was not a PhD economist, but he studied economics at Cornell, and he listened to his professors, because here's what he did. He saw all these empty airline seats and all these empty hotel rooms. And he said, you know, this is criminal that we have all these, you know, when you check into an airport, or either an airline or a hotel and you got all these empty seats, that means all this money's on the table that hasn't been collected. How are you going to collect this money? So here's the problem. You could discount. You could selectively discount and give last people, you know, a cheaper fare, but how are you going to prevent then people who have already made reservations from canceling what they have now and then getting the cheaper price? So what you want to do is selectively price discriminate. That's what you want to do, all right? And you want to do it in a way so that you will not encourage all those fancy business travelers who book way ahead to wait until the last minute to take the cheapest price. So what they invented was, if you've ever done business on Priceline, is an inferior product. The inferior product is that you put in a city and you don't have a choice about what airline, what particular air flight that you're going to get. All you do is you bid and you say, I'm willing to pay $20, and they assign you the air flight. You know, you put a day in. The same with the hotel. You say within a certain radius, and you have to take basically whatever it is. Your power is you can bid a lowball price, all right? Now, business people will never take that deal because they want a sure thing. So he is discriminated against, he's discriminated in a way that he solved that problem, you see, because he's offering an inferior product to the people who are willing to pay low dollars. And then how does he prevent those low dollar people, once they bid, from walking away from the deal? You know how he does it? He requires a credit card at the beginning. So as soon as you put in 20 bucks and it's accepted, your card is charged instantly. Bingo. Priceline today is worth $60 billion. All right? One guy who took an economics course, who thought of a problem once the internet happened, and he made it into a big company. I hope you're getting the idea here, all right, that economists can actually be useful, all right, and it's actually happening in the real world. Now, actually, I show you a picture of some macroeconomists, and I told you we don't largely do macro forecasting. I don't have time to do all that right now, but because I want to lead you into the third question. Macro forecasting happens to deal with a field called econometrics. And econometrics is the scientific application of statistics to economic forecasting. What I want in this question, and this is a hard one, is which pair of economists were the first to win the Nobel Prize for econometrics? That's our third question. So we're going to go back to the cell phone and see if we can answer that question. You have to push back and then go to First Economists and push that on and see which group you've got. Anybody got a guess? Or these are names you wouldn't recognize. Well, okay, somebody said D? Huh? You said D. We got a very smart guy there. He's right. George is right. And here is a good factoid about Fritsch and Tinbergen. They were the first economists ever to win a Nobel Prize. You know who the second was? Second was Paul Samuelson, and the third was Milton Friedman. I am pretty sure Milton beat, no, then you're right, I stand corrected. Then Friedman must have won it after Hayek. Okay, because Friedman won it after Samuelson, all right? But these two guys were the first ones to win it. Okay, we got a smart guy here. All right, next one. Now, how many have read, well, actually, first, do you know who this guy is? His name is Michael Lewis. Does that ring any bells? All right, wrote Flash, huh? Moneyball. He wrote Moneyball. They made a movie out of it. All right? Now, Moneyball is the application of statistics and economics to the forecasting of performance on the field. It started with baseball. It has now spread to every sport. All right? In fact, I brought an article today from the Wall Street Journal, but by coincidence, 2 days ago, back page on B6, Moneyball hits middle school. We have a whole new generation of kids who are obsessed with statistics. All right? And it talks about 3 really smart 14-year-olds who know more statistics than any of us when we were growing up. All right? And statistics, not just batting averages, but statistics that matter in terms of predicting player performance. And this guy wrote about it. Now, it turns out that he did not invent Moneyball. Do you know who this guy is? Anybody recognize him? Clue, he's from Kansas. No help? Another clue, he went to KU. Bill James, all right? Bill James invented the Bible on baseball statistics in his garage, or in his backyard garage in Lawrence, Kansas. Bill James went on to basically found an entire field called sabermetrics, and he was hired by the Boston Red Sox to basically apply all this stuff. So Moneyball now is controlling or very heavily influencing the sports industry. Footnote, my son is now in a related business in this. So I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree because I was a sports nut when I was growing up. But I'll tell you where Moneyball is going to make its next big application. I haven't had time to redo the presentation. Does anybody do fantasy sports? Daily fantasy sports? Are you into daily fantasy sports? All right. So fantasy sports, as you know, is you compile the teams, you have a limited budget, and basically you're able to buy teams, and you win depending on how your team does. There is now a huge multi-billion-dollar industry in the overnight assembly of teams. So in other words, I can assemble a basketball team of LeBron and Stephen Curry. By the way, that game last night was unbelievable. If anybody watched Stephen Curry last night, it was incredible. You can assemble teams overnight in sports sites right now. And then essentially, you can then, the people that assemble the players that do the best on the next night win. And they have jackpots now that are in the tens of thousands or 50,000s. There are people that now do this for a living. There are big articles about this. Well, all I can tell you is that the statistical extrapolation of how well sports players are doing is all grown out of Moneyball. And I'm telling you that there is going to be an application of people who supply this kind of forecasting tools in the same way that Value Line now provides it for stocks. You're going to see it for sports. Trust me. There are businesses that are going to do this. All right, I'm not going to bore you with all of this. I am going to show you these two guys. These two guys won the Nobel Prize in 2013. You know who they are? The guy on the left, he's from Chicago. For those of you who are into free market economics, his name is Gene Fama. And the guy on the right is Bob Shiller at Yale. Shiller is famous for having predicted the financial crisis. He's one of the few who has. They have diametrically opposite views on whether stock markets are efficient. All right? Fama basically says no, says yes, and Shiller says no. But they agree on one thing. They agree that for the general average investor who doesn't have a lot of money, index investing is the way to go. You should not be picking stocks. They both agree on that. The next two guys, well, actually, I have one more question before I get to the next two guys, and then we're almost done. The last question on your mobile phone is which financial economist has not won a Nobel Prize? So it's going to be the last question, financial Nobel. Okay, you done? All right, the answer is Burton Malkiel. Does anybody recognize that name? He wrote a famous book, Random Walk Down Wall Street. It's probably in its 10th printing, one of the most famous books ever in finance, but he's the only person on that list who has not won a Nobel Prize. In a way, kind of shocking. Now, here are two guys that made a fortune off of index investing, just to prove to you that the idea of index investing is not just some abstract idea. The person on the right is who? Does anybody know him? John Bogle. So he founded Vanguard, all right? And the Index 500, the whole business, he wrote his senior thesis at Princeton based on work that Paul Samuelson had done, arguing that we ought to have an S&P 500 index. He did it in 1951. He later went on to found Vanguard and introduced the index in about the 1970s. The guy on the left, does anybody know who he is? Clue, he went to KU. Another clue, the University of Chicago's business school is named after him. His name is David Booth. David Booth is a multi-billionaire who now lives in Austin, Texas. He runs a company called Dimensional Advisors that has a lot of Nobel Prize winners as advisors. David Booth got the brilliant idea when he was young. He studied under Gene Fama. He got the brilliant idea that instead of doing an index fund for large cap companies, you should do them for small cap companies. He sold the idea to pension funds, proved that small cap companies over time largely outperforms large cap companies, and built an entire business based on it. He now manages over $25 billion in money, all based on index investing. All right. So again, I'm hoping I'm convincing you that economists, again, are actually useful. All right, I want to give you a final example, and then we can go to questions. I actually want to go back. Is there a way to go back? I went too far, all right, because these are three ideas that are eventually waiting on the table, and if we have time, we'll talk about them. I just want to give you one final example. No, two final examples. Ways in which economists have indirectly helped a lot of business. My first claim is that economists help make internet retailing possible. Internet retailing is a $300 billion industry right now, all right, and only growing. It's going through the sky, all right? There are two things that made internet retailing possible. One, we had to have fiber optics to be built out to build the backbone of the internet. You know what made fiber optics possible and what really accelerated the build out of the internet? Is when we broke up AT&T. After AT&T was broken up, then Sprint and MCI, which is now dead, they laid fiber optic cable. They did not invent fiber optic cable. Who invented it? Bell Labs. Why didn't AT&T lay fiber optic cable? Answer, they had copper wires they didn't want to dig up. So they had no incentive to replace the copper wire with fiber optics. Once AT&T was broken up, they had competition. Sprint, remember the pin drop ads, and MCI came in, laid fiber optic cable, built the internet, and we all take it for granted today. All right, so it wouldn't have existed. There were economists in both the Johnson administration, in the Nixon administration, and the Ford administration, and ultimately in the Reagan administration, it was Bill Baxter who broke up AT&T, all based on the work of economists, I argue in the book. That's the first thing. Second thing, remember airline regulation I talked about in the old days? Now, can you imagine Amazon starting in a world in which airlines and trucks are regulated in every route, in every fare that they charge? Can you imagine them promising to ship you something anywhere, anytime, 24 hours in a world of highly regulated industry? No way. Jeff Bezos never could have gotten started in the 1970s. Jeff Bezos was lucky that he was born when he was, because when he was born, those industries were deregulated. And by the way, they were deregulated by a Democrat who was not well liked, but he was deregulated largely because of Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy. And it's one of the amazing things that they did in the 1970s. And as a result, internet retailing, largely, which is based on a flexible transportation system, which is UPS and FedEx, we wouldn't have those outfits today if we hadn't deregulated the industry. So that's my first example. And the economists were crucial in getting Kennedy and Carter to deregulate the industry. That's my first example. My second example is one that you all know well. We're here at the Petroleum Club, all right? And this is like preaching to the converted, all right? So back in the 1970s, we regulated the price of oil, all right? So when we had the crisis with the Arab oil embargo, we had long lines. Obviously, it was stupid to regulate oil prices, all right? Remember, I mean, all of us, we're old enough to remember this. Well, the amazing thing is that when prices went up in the 2000s, there was no regulation. And that's how we got the shale gas revolution, is because we had economic incentives for people to marry horizontal drilling with fracking. And that created the surplus in oil and gas that we have today. Well, the reason that happened is that we decontrolled the price of oil and gas in the 1980s, after that stupid experience in the 1970s. And again, who were the prime intellectual movers behind deregulation of oil and gas? Economists. All right. Hopefully, as they say in Latin proof, QED. Okay? I hope I've shown to you that economists are still useful. I have some ideas I can talk about that are on the shelf that haven't yet been influenced, but trust me, there are a lot of ideas out there that are circulating that I think will find their way into practical application. I'll quit there and be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Microphone back here. If you've got questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring it your way.
Yeah.
Economists are going to take credit for some good side.
Yep.
How would you address the monetary issue when you've got the Federal Reserve balance sheet growing from $800 billion roughly to about $4.5 billion today?
Right. Okay, I knew that question was coming. Look, I am of the view that the Fed saved the economy from a disaster. If Milton Friedman were alive in 2008, he would have done the same thing as Ben Bernanke. He would have flooded the economy with money. It was in his writings. He basically said when the economy's falling apart, in fact, his main critique when he wrote The History of the Fed with Anna Schwartz was the Fed in the 1930s did not print money, all right? And as a result, we had lots of banks closing and the economy going in the tank. Ben Bernanke wrote his PhD thesis and built his entire economics career based on his analysis of the Depression. And I think it was a fortuitous thing in American history that we had Ben Bernanke as Fed chairman at the time of this crisis. He did a lot of unconventional things, like expanding the Fed's balance sheet. And the reason why he did that is that interest rates had already gone to zero. All right, so he couldn't push interest rates any lower. So what he did is he bought long-term bonds and stuffed the Fed's balance sheet. And there were a lot of people out there who said, well, if you do that, it's going to cause inflation. I want you to look at the record between 2009 and today. Inflation has been below 2% for 6 or 7 straight years, all right? And in fact, the Fed is still worried that the inflation rate is not high enough. So in my view, the Fed has done the right thing. I know that is not the view of maybe a lot of people in this room, but I can tell you, at least among a lot of the economists I hang around with, we think that Ben Bernanke will be recognized in history as one of the saviors of the economy after the 2008 financial crisis, and that is my view.
Next question, right here.
Economic incentives
Yeah.
in government for private industry I disagree with that. Is there any way to get rid of it, or do you think it ought to be kept around?
Incentives
Where the government takes tax money and gives it to somebody.
Oh, well, you're talking about the tax system being riddled with loopholes and all kinds of preferences and so forth, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, in a perfect world, I'd love to get rid of it all. I'd love to have a lower corporate rate and get rid of a lot of get rid of all the preferences. But the big problem in Washington is that we've got a gazillion people whose oxes are going to be gored, and it's very hard to get consensus, which is why we haven't had tax reform yet. But in a perfect world, yes. And by the way, I started my economics career at Brookings in 1972 working as a research assistant for an economist who's now deceased named Joe Peckman. Joe Peckman is a liberal, but Joe Peckman wrote in his entire career, said on the personal side, not on the corporate side, basically lower the rates and get rid of a lot of the deductions. And that's what we did with the Reagan reform in 1986. All right? And ever since the Reagan reform, both Republicans and Democrats have junked up the tax code. All right? So now it's littered with all this junk. All right? And one of the reasons we did it, or I'm not saying we, I didn't do this, but our elected representatives did this, is that they were so afraid of spending money directly, they spent it indirectly through tax expenditures. And they filled the tax hole, the tax code with this. But it took Republicans and Democrats to agree in '86 that we ought to flatten the rates and get rid of the deductions. And the rates were lowest in 1986 on corporate, on personal income taxes. I wish we could go back to that world. I mean, but politically, I don't have to tell you, we don't have any consensus to do that. But that is the ideal that I vote for. And I can tell you that liberal economists were as much behind that idea as conservative economists. They agreed with each other. And by the way, they still do. They still do. It's the politicians who can't get together.
Next question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. It's been a very good presentation. Really enjoyed it. A couple of months ago, you ran a piece in the Wall Street Journal why low oil prices won't doom renewable energy, and you referenced a blog or another article at least that talked about the financial advisory firm Lazard citing that wind and solar are practically on par now with conventional sources of generation.
Right.
Is that a pretty good take on things?
Yeah, I think you're referring to a blog. Yeah, I regularly blog for the Wall Street Journal. It's hard to find my stuff. It's something on the Capitol blog. And by the way, one of the things that I did when I got your email addresses is that if you want, and you can tell me to go to hell after the very first one, but I will send you a blog that I make occasionally, and you'll see what I write. And I've got your addresses, and if you don't want them, just say I don't want to hear from you again. So more than happy to tell me that. But in that blog, I did write that there's been a dramatic reduction in the cost of solar, and it's continuing to decline. So even though oil prices decline, solar is competitive. But remember, solar can't run cars. All right, we're still going to need oil or natural gas to run cars. So there'll still be a big demand for fossil fuels. Whatever, solar is useful for electricity, and only for intermittent electricity because there's no way to store it. All right. So the only way you can use it for base load is out in California and Florida where the sun shines every day. But it's got limited uses in a lot of other parts of the country. Yeah.
I really didn't address the question correctly. I think one key part I left out was that on an unsubsidized basis.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're right. And solar has been subsidized, but even on an unsubsidized basis, and by the way, we shouldn't have subsidies anymore for this. I fully agree. I think, but by the way, if we're going to get rid of subsidies for solar, we ought to get rid of them for oil too. We ought to get rid of it for all energy. All right, in an ideal world, and just let the market decide. That's the right answer. But the technological change in solar is so rapid that it would survive in niche markets regardless.
If Bernanke's philosophy saved the economy, it doesn't seem like we're in that good shape. What would happen if it's not done?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, that's a very good question because if we had not had monetary stimulus, we'd be the unemployment rate would be a lot higher than it is today. How much higher? I can't tell you, a point or two, but certainly we would not be as healthy as we are today. And today isn't great, and I'll concede that. All right, and we can debate till the cows come home, about why the economy hasn't done as well in this recovery. I know there's been a lot of excess regulation, and that's certainly one cause. But I think you also can't discount the fact that consumers were just traumatized as hell with the decline of the value of their houses. And they've never gotten over it.
Yes, did we ever get rid of farm subsidies?
Yeah, I'm speaking in the wrong state about this, but in an ideal world, yes. I mean, I'm basically a free market guy on all this. I think the government ought to be out of all of it. All right, it's a waste. All right, and by the way, as long as I'm talking about the government, the biggest problem the government has in the long run, I don't have to tell you, is the entitlement programs. All right, and a lot of us in the room are going to benefit from them. I mean, I get my first Social Security check next month. I'm not Social Security, Medicare. I'm waiting for Social Security. But in any event, we've got to do something about this because the nation will go bankrupt eventually, and we can't do this, or we'll inflate our way out of the problem. We'll just print money. But you know, the latest forecasts show that we can get by for probably the next 10 years without a major crisis. But in the 2020s or somehow, the projections show that the ratio of the deficits to GDP and debt to GDP go off the chart in the mid-20s. And I'm just hoping that somehow, you know, we came close to a political bargain during Obama and Boehner. They came this close, but it didn't happen. And I'm hoping whoever's president next time will actually be able to get together with the two parties and do this, because it's got to happen.
How do you see the health of the Chinese economy?
Well, you know, people were spooked about China because it was growing at 10%. Now it's growing at 7%. So the fact is that, you know, Herb Stein was President Nixon's chief economic advisor, and he had a very famous phrase. He said, "Something that can't go on forever won't." All right? You can't grow at 10% forever. All right? That means you're doubling every 7 years. I mean, yeah, every 7 years. You can't do this. All right? So China's slowing down. From 10, now they're down to 7. In the future, they'll get slower. As they approach asymptotically other countries, their growth rate's going to slow. It's inevitable. It has to. It happens with every country. All right? Because people get closer to the frontier. And so the short answer is that's inevitable. Second thing is that is actually, that's a challenge to the rest of the world. We've got to get growth from somebody else. But there are a lot of other poor parts of the world that need fixing. I don't have to tell you. We in the United States should be for other countries getting rich because it helps us sell stuff abroad. And that's good for the world. I'm a free trader, unabashed free trader. And again, something that's gone out of style in Washington, and that's also unfortunate. Yeah.
I like your free trade ideas, and I like the idea that every one of your success stories shows that economists are successful when they appreciate and understand psychology.
Yes.
With that in mind, what do you say about the fair tax, and what advice would you give our governor and legislature here in Kansas? We have a real problem, but kind of two questions there, but they're related in that the governor wants to go toward the fair tax.
Right. Well, the fair tax basically is it's flat tax. Right. Basically.
Right.
All right. And there are two well-known economists who came up with sort of the classic fair tax. I mean, there are a lot of variations of the fair tax, but two of the most famous ones are Bob Hall, who's a good friend of mine at Stanford, and Al Rabushka. The Hal Rabushka tax that would be 19%, and you get rid of all the deductions, et cetera. All right. And there are variations. I am generally for at least a couple of layers in the tax. In other words, a couple of levels, because I really do believe that we can't, politically and I think morally, I am not for having everyone pay the same rate. All right. I mean, I really do think lower income people ought to pay a lower rate. But I'd still like to get rid of all the deductions so we keep the top rate down. All right. So I don't think we'll ever get to a pure fair tax or a pure flat rate in this country. But I think, as I said before, if we can get rid of a lot of those deductions, we could lower the rate. By the way, one other Republican economist has come up with a very good idea. It's Marty Feldstein. All right, he was chief economic advisor to President Reagan. He basically said, because he knows how complicated and difficult it is to get rid of all these deductions, he said, let's just put a cap on all your deductions. Say that your cap is you can't deduct any more than 2 or 3% of your adjusted gross income. All right. So take your home, your mortgage, your your charitable, your property tax, et cetera. Add it all together. We don't care really which, but there's a cap, a 2% cap. So you can still keep those deductions, but we're just going to limit the amount of deductions. And then you can raise By putting a cap on that, you can raise $2 trillion over the course of a decade. And $2 trillion would go a long way towards solving our deficit reduction problem. Now, people say, well, we ought to reduce the rates to compensate for that. You can do that, but then you're not going to solve the deficit problem. But I think Feldstein's idea is a very clever one, of putting an overall cap, rather than tell you we're just going to take charitable away, which is impossible, or take home mortgage interest away and nothing else. You can't do that. It's politically impossible.
Last question.
Last question. Yeah.
You're a native Wichitan?
Yeah.
You've been gone for how many years?
46.
What's it like? What's your view of your hometown coming back?
I've been here a year, and here are the good things. I live on the east side, and within 5 minutes of my house, I can go to Fresh Market, Whole Foods, and in 2 months, Costco. All right? This is a good thing. All right? This is an indicator that we're a major league town. All right? And the other major reason I moved back is that I'm a huge Wichita Shocker basketball fan. All right? Huge. All right? Not KU, Wichita State. All right? And needless to say, my heart and my wife and our hearts were palpitating about 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, whenever Greg Marshall was talking to Alabama. And thank goodness to Charles Koch and his friends who helped save and kept Marshall here, at least for now. So those are all good things. Let me tell you the bad thing. Our schools have gone to hell. And this is a tragedy to me. I went to Southeast. Southeast was a great high school. Yes, it was. Can you say that today? I don't think you can. In fact, I don't think you can say that with the Wichita schools. And I was talking to George the other day. He's got some very depressing statistics about educational attainment in this state, in this city. And I'll give you one statistic, and I can't give you the source of it, and then I'll close. And it's a challenge to Wichita. There was a ranking of high schools in the state of Kansas that I read, and I can't tell you the source. And it ranked all the high schools. And our best high school, our best local high school is East. All right? It's a magnet school. It's got the IB program. You know where East ranked in the state? 31st. The top 10 schools in the state are all in Kansas City. And of those, almost all of them are in the Blue Valley School District. That's a damn shame. That's a criminal shame. All right? And I'll tell you something else, and it's a thing that I do not understand. And George is trying to educate me as to why this is. We're a red state, all right? So we're a solid Republican state. You would think that we would have a very liberal charter law for charter schools, all right, like Arizona, or even Missouri, because I worked in Missouri. I worked in Kansas City for 10 years. There are 18 charter schools in Kansas City, Missouri, which, by the way, has a horrible school system too, but at least they have some charter schools that give poor kids some choice, all right? We don't give anybody any choice in this city or this state. I mean, if back to Sam Brownback, there's number one thing I would fight more than anything else is I'd fight for a liberal charter school law in this state. And I hope all you, as you can tell, you agree with me. I think this ought to be the number one priority, because I'll tell you, economic research shows that if you want to determine the single variable that predicts the success of a city in terms of its growth, its GDP, or its state, it's the level of education of its citizens. And we are abysmal. And unless we turn that around, Wichita does not have a good future. And it's the responsibility of all of us to try to hopefully get the law changed so that we can bring that good future to the state of Kansas. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Robert Litan, let's give him a standing ovation for a fantastic presentation.